Hello there and welcome to Quarantine Ballistics. Once again we're closed in my home lab, so let's see if I can tell you something interesting nevertheless.
The first two facts regard magazines. First one, does keeping magazines full damage them? The short answer is not really, but there's a little more to it. Every material that is kept under load for a prolonged period of time can sustain permanent deformations, even if its elastic limit is never exceeded. In our case, we have a spring which is forced to stay in a limited space, and the build-up of irreversible plastic deformation would cause the spring to lose force in a phenomenon known as relaxation.
If instead the force is kept constant and the length changes, it is usually referred to as creep, but the mechanism is exactly the same. Now, these phenomena are essentially caused by thermal agitation of atoms and are therefore of a significant magnitude only when the operating temperature of the component is high enough compared to the metal's melting temperature. In detail, if the operating temperature is less than 1/3 of the absolute melting temperature of the alloy, the material creeping is extremely slow and in common designing practice is totally neglected. For steel, the threshold temperature is about 300 degrees Celsius, so at room temperature and in typical use, which is always under 50 degrees C, creep and relaxation are practically non-existent.
Yet if you take a new magazine, fill it up completely, wait 1 year, take the spring out and compare it with a new one, you will see it has shortened a little, and this guy actually did this exact test.
So why is it? Well, first, the rate of relaxation doesn't only depend on temperature, but also on stress, and springs typically work at very high stresses, roughly 2 to 3 times higher than typical steel components. But second and most importantly, even though at room temperature the relaxation or creep rate is so slow to be usually negligible, that relates to steady state creep, also known as second phase creep. That occupies by far the longest part of the component's life, and that's why it is considered to be the most important, especially at high temperatures. However, a first phase also exists, during which the rate of deformation is much higher, but that usually doesn't last very long. This, combined with the high stress, explains why we experience some spring set, but also translates into a reassuring fact. Even though a new spring will slowly relax if kept near maximum load, it will only do it to an extent. Once the first creep phase is over, relaxation basically stops.
Proper designs are made from the start to compensate for that relaxation, so your magazine will keep working fine even after the spring is set.
Still, I would suggest not to put the last round in the mag. First, because creep's dependence on stress is highly nonlinear, so the last round is the most damaging one, but mostly because of our second fact.
In most magazines, the last round gets some of the coils to touch each other, and this makes the cartridge column very stiff to push down, which means that if you want to insert it on a closed slide, you'll have to give it a good whack to get it in, otherwise the mag might fall. This is particularly true if you don't want to ditch the previous mag and have to keep it in your hand during reloading.
Okay, the third one is an interesting curiosity. Did you know that there is a common product you can find in almost every supermarket which contains basically pure nitrocellulose, like smokeless powder is made of? I give you 5 seconds to guess in the comments.
Have you ever heard of smokeless indoor fireworks, like those you put on a birthday cake? Not surprisingly, they share their main ingredient with smokeless powder. They are just pure nitrocellulose, in powdered form and compressed into a cardboard tube. The only added ingredient is metallic magnesium in the form of fine shavings, which are responsible for the sparkliness. By the way, I am by no means suggesting that you disassemble one of these or use its filling for anything else than birthday parties. Nitrocellulose would need to be processed to make it into any safe and usable propellant.
Alright, the fourth fact regards armor-piercing ammunition. For some reason, anything that is or has been used by the military is fertile ground for fanciful myths regarding their almost supernatural performance. But in reality, very often they are just very mundane technologies used for a different purpose.
As I showed in an earlier video, tracer composition is basically the same stuff that you find in a road flare. Something very similar happens for armor-piercing ammo. I've heard lots of laughable stories about them. Somebody even went as far as telling me to be careful with 50 BMG cores because they might be made of depleted uranium.
Now, uranium has 2.5 times the density of steel. If a core this size was made of it, the bullet would have weighted about 1100 grains, which is obviously not the case. Also, as far as I know, no uranium containing 50 BMG load has ever been deployed. And what about tungsten? Well, same reasoning applies. It has about the same density as uranium, or slightly less in case of cemented tungsten carbide.
In any case, a penetrator of a given size made of a tungsten-based material would weigh at least 80% more than if it was made out of steel, so you can easily find out if a penetrator is made of tungsten simply by comparing its weight to its volume. Another way is using a magnet. Tungsten is non-magnetic and its cemented carbides are just slightly magnetic. As you can see, this penetrator is instead very strongly attracted to a magnet, indicating that it is made of steel. And in fact, the vast majority of armor-piercing ammunition up to and including 50 BMG is made using a hardened steel penetrator.
But what kind of steel is this? Is it some top-secret military alloy? Not really. In reality, most of you have a very similar material at home right now.
If you think about it, what makes up a good penetrator also makes for a good drill bit.
The exact composition and heat treat can be tweaked to tailor specific needs, but small penetrators for bullets are still made with some kind of tool steel. They allow reaching very high hardnesses due to the precipitation of metallic carbides without rendering the whole component too brittle, which is the reason why recovered penetrators tend to be either practically undeformed or shattered in 2 or more pieces.
As you can see, both the AP core and the drill bit are untouched by steel tools but are easily scratched by a cemented carbide tip. Tungsten, usually in the form of cemented carbide, is seldomly used in portable weapons for 2 reasons.
The first is that tungsten is expensive both to extract and manufacture. For a penetrator core, we're looking at no less than $50 per kilo. But there is another strictly technical reason, which is even more important than the first one, and which is the subject of today's riddle, so guess it in the comments. The 5th fact is instead about smoke. As you all know, modern ammunition is loaded with smokeless powder, which is named like that for a reason. It almost makes no smoke when burning.
Yet we often see some smoke, sometimes a substantial amount of it when shooting, especially with handguns. So where does it come from? Well, most of the times it comes from the bullet and not the powder. Bare lead bullets have to be lubricated to prevent them from leading barrels, and that lubricant is the culprit of the smokiness. It usually is deposited in 1 or more grooves on the side of the bullet, and during shooting it gets partly burnt and vaporized, and that's where the smoke comes from. Filming lubricants like Lee liquid alox or those used for 22 long rifles smoke as well, and usually have a very distinct smell. If you want to get rid of smoke, you'll have to do without the lube, which requires covering the lead. Using a jacketed or copper-plated bullet eliminates smoke, but they are usually more expensive than cast lead bullets, in which case a good solution which came up recently is powder-coated bullets. Provided they are shot at the velocities recommended for lead bullets, they make practically no smoke without leading the barrel. Actually, you can usually see on recovered bullets that the polymer coating is still bonded to the side of the bullet. In typical rifle calibers, bullets are always jacketed, so this problem doesn't arise. Anyway, I hope you learned something new and want to thank my beloved Patreon supporters which are allowing this type of not so politically correct content to be produced. Thanks to promotedpwn.com, Carson Polar, Robert Jan Madry, Logan Moore and my other 8 patrons, I can keep making content without giving up my freedom of speech. Thank you all for watching, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you next time. Bye.